They don't teach you about the Lemkos in school. Not in Poland. Not in Ukraine. Not even in the places where their bones still lie buried beneath the moss. Entire villages gone from the map. Churches burned. Languages folded into silence. But somehow, their DNA refused to disappear. Because hidden inside the bloodlines of this vanishing people, in old family albums tucked inside barns, in cheek swabs mailed from Silesia to Chicago, scientists kept finding something strange. A maternal code. Haplogroup I, one of the rarest genetic signatures in Europe. Born over 20,000 years ago, somewhere in the shadows of West Asia, and now, found more often in Lemkos than anywhere else on the continent. How does a forgotten people, scattered by war and erased by politics, hold the deepest genetic key to Europe's past? This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a one-off. Study after study, Nikitin, 2009, kept reporting the same anomaly. 11% of Lemko women carried it. 11. That's higher than Scotland, higher than France, higher than any European population ever recorded. And yet, ask the world who the Lemkos are, and most will answer with silence. Not a lost tribe, they say. Not biblical. Not real. But the numbers say otherwise. This wasn't just an old gene resurfacing. This was something ancient that never left. A signature that survived forced migration, survived Operation Vistula, survived the rewriting of borders, surnames, memory. It's as if their mothers, and their mothers' mothers, built a genetic time capsule in the Carpathians and buried it in plain sight. But this opens a darker question. Because Haplogroup I didn't come from the Carpathians. So where did it come from? And why did it survive, almost untouched, in a tribe the world chose to forget? How did this forgotten mountain people inherit one of the rarest genomes in Europe? Somewhere between the mists of Poland, Ukraine, and Slovakia, there's a valley no one can quite agree on. A place called Lemkivshchyna. No highways cut through it. No billboards. No border checkpoint stamps. Just winding trails that vanish into pine. Onion-domed chapels that lean like tired elders, and silence thick enough to remember every whisper ever spoken. Here, the mountains do something strange to time. And for centuries, this is where the Lemkos lived. Not visited. Not passed through. Lived. They carved homes into ridgelines. Built three-chambered churches with bare hands and oak beams. Spoke a dialect no one else did, full of soft bends and the word lem, meaning only, or just. Their rituals? Byzantine. Their icons? Eastern. Their prayers? Sung low, by candlelight, in smoky chapels where Polish soldiers once raided, and Ukrainian priests once wept. But identity here was never simple. Ask a map, and it'll call this Polish land. Ask a priest, and it might sound Ukrainian. Ask a Soviet officer from 1947, and he'd say, these are Rusins, or Russians, or no one at all. That's the curse of Lemkivshchyna. Everyone wants to claim it, but no one really knows it. And the people who knew it best? They were scattered, not by nature, but by design. Some Lemkos called themselves Ukrainians. Others, fiercely not. Some registered as Polish, just to survive. Some refused to answer at all. But here's the real twist. Even their enemies couldn't agree what they were. A people without a nation. A language without a country. A faith with two altars. Yet in these ridges, something held them together. Something older than politics. Something that refused to break. But if the Lemkos stood apart from every group around them, then who were they before the world split them? Why does no one, not the historians, not the linguists, not even the DNA labs, agree on where the Lemkos came from? Most people don't know this, but the Lemkos once declared their own country. Not one. Two. A pair of republics, raised like fragile flags in the aftermath of World War I, when empires fell and borders bled. The Kamenksa Republic, pro-Ukrainian, hoping to join a rising West Ukraine, and the Lemko-Rusin Republic, pro-Russian, dreaming of a homeland tied to Slavic roots, to something older, purer. For a flicker of time, they stood. Small towns signed proclamations. Peasants swore oaths. Icons were lifted and choirs sang. Not for Poland. Not for Austria. Not for any crown. For themselves. But no army came to protect them. No treaty bore their name. Within months, the Polish state rolled in and rolled over. Leaders were arrested, flags torn down. The republics vanished before most of the world even knew they'd existed. No one taught this in school. Not in Warsaw. Not in Kiev. Not in Moscow. It was easier to pretend they'd never tried. Easier to say the Lemkos were confused, divided, backward, too small to matter. But it mattered to them. To the old man in Florinka who carved the date of the Republic into his wooden gate, knowing someday someone might ask. To the choir in Kamenksa who sang every liturgy like it was a declaration. To the mothers who buried their sons, not as Poles or Ukrainians, but as Lemkos. What do you call a nation erased before it could take its first breath? And what happens when the memory of that breath gets buried not just in history, but in blood? Because the day those republics fell, something deeper began to fracture. Not just land, identity. And what followed would make even ghosts hard to trace. Then came the deportations, and with them, a scientific silence. It started with a knock, then a silence that never left. Spring 1947. The Polish state called it Operation Vistula. The Lemkos remember it by a different name, Agja Wisla, the season the earth broke. Families were given 2 weeks. No appeal. No questions. Take what you can carry, livestock, icons, your mother's wedding dress, and wait for the train. But the trains weren't for travel. They were for scattering. Cattle cars, padlocked, sweltering in daylight, freezing by night. Children wept into soot. Elders clutched rosaries, unsure which God still heard them. And what they left behind wasn't just homes. It was carved altars, wooden churches with onion domes torched, graveyards bulldozed, Lemko names erased from signs, censuses stone. One woman said, "We took the church bell with us, that was all." Another whispered, "My mother vanished during the journey. No one saw her step off." From the Carpathians to the flat, foreign fields of western Poland, they were dropped like seeds, but forbidden to take root. No more than 3 Lemko families per village. By law. A deliberate shattering, designed to end them. And yet, not all of them disappeared. Some bent, married into silence, registered as Polish, changed names to survive. But others held fast. They lit candles on Vatra nights, taught their children the Lem word, smuggled songs through generations, like contraband for the soul. And slowly, quietly, a diaspora formed. In Canada, in Cleveland, in Kiev, in Silesia. They had no homeland, no army, no flag. But the stories, they didn't die. Because there was something deeper still, something even war couldn't uproot. A fragment that kept showing up, over and over, in the blood of Lemko daughters and grandmothers across continents. Something ancient, still tying them together. Something even war couldn't destroy. At first, it looked like a mistake. A data blip, buried in a spreadsheet from a quiet lab in Ukraine. Haplogroup I, an ancient maternal lineage, older than pyramids, older than language, born somewhere near the ice-blown ridges of West Asia, over 20,000 years ago. It's barely found in Europe today. Less than 1%, scattered like ashes across the continent. But in the Lemkos? 11.3%. More than Scotland. More than France. More than anywhere. And no one could explain why. Not in this scattered mountain people. Not here. Not in the Carpathians, where borders blur and memory fractures. This wasn't supposed to be here. But there it was, again and again, in the DNA of Lemko women, passed from mother to daughter, generation to generation, like a whisper sealed in bone. Haplogroup I had survived, not in cities, or empires, or archives, but in forgotten villages with no names left on maps. And when scientists plotted its trail, it didn't point to Poland, or Ukraine, or Russia. It pointed to Iran, to Yemen, to the edge of East Africa, to ancient nomads buried beneath Kenyan soil, and then suddenly to a remote cluster of wooden churches tucked in the Beskid Hills. What was it doing there? Who brought it? Was it a glacial age wanderer? A shepherd from the steppes? A refugee from a time before time? Or something else entirely? Because if Lemkos carry the highest concentration of this lost maternal genome, then we're not just looking at survivors of displacement. We're looking at carriers of something prehistoric, something that slipped past war, assimilation, erasure, something that doesn't match the history books at all. So what are we really seeing? A trace of a forgotten migration, or something even older. It wasn't supposed to be there. An Asian genome, tucked inside the mitochondrial map of a Carpathian shepherd. Not in Poland, not in Eastern Europe, and definitely not in the Lemkos. But there it was, Haplogroup M. Not just a trace, not a rounding error. 5.7%, in a population that should have had none. This lineage, M star, belongs to a different map entirely. One that arcs from the Himalayas to the Ganges, from Mongolia to the islands of Indonesia, carried by traders, steppe nomads, empires that rose and fell before parchment had ink. And yet, it surfaces not in great cities, but in these forgotten highlands, among people who lived by herding sheep, not charting global trade. What was it doing in the blood of Lemko women? This wasn't seen in their neighbors, not in the Hutzels, not in the Boykos, not in the Poles who tried to erase them, only in the Lemkos. And then the dialect offered a whisper, words that weren't quite Slavic, tucked into their songs, their prayers, their shepherd tools, terms that hint of Vlach influence, old Balkan routes, maybe even deeper, a rope of language stretching back to Aromanian traders, Wallachian caravans, maybe even the bones of forgotten steppe tribes. Did they meet somewhere, high in these mountains? A marriage, a child, a daughter whose DNA would echo 5,000 years later. Or was this something older, a ghost of the Silk Road, carried in silence across generations? The villages remember none of it. No records, no epics, just the genes surviving in exile, as if something crossed continents and chose to stay hidden here. But here's the riddle. Out of all the Carpathians, why did this ancient Asian lineage settle inside the Lemkos? Why do these signatures, relics of lost migrations, remain? Only in the Lemkos? They typed in their name, clicked submit, waited weeks, and when the DNA results came back, it was like a second exile. Eastern European, Polish, Ukrainian, maybe a touch of Balkan. But nowhere did it say Lemko. One woman stared at the screen and whispered, "My family history was erased again, this time by a lab report." Because even in science, they were miscategorized. The algorithm couldn't find them. Not in the databases, not in the geopolitical boxes built by war and redrawn borders. But when real geneticists, not ancestry apps, ran the full sequence, the Lemkos didn't cluster with Poles, not with Ukrainians, not even with their Carpathian cousins. Instead, their DNA leaned toward Romanians, toward Czechs, toward Highland people who shared no border, but shared something else, a quiet, ancestral thread, something older than nations. And that's where the contradiction cracks wide open. Because for over a century, politicians and priests have tried to define Lemko identity by what it isn't. Not Ukrainian enough, not Polish enough, not Russian enough. But what if they were never meant to fit those molds? What if the tests fail not because the Lemkos are unclear, but because the categories are wrong? Still, culture has its own memory. At the Vatrafire festivals, you can hear it. Old folk songs sung in a language no app can classify. Young men in woven sashes, dancing beside elders who still remember the deportations. Girls placing pine branches on gravestones, humming lullabies in a dialect that once almost disappeared. They gather not just to celebrate, but to prove they exist. To remind the world, and maybe themselves, that identity can survive even when no one recognizes it. But if your genome doesn't place you where your soul lives, if DNA can lie, what does it mean to truly belong? Not all migrations move forward. Some hide. Tens of thousands of years ago, as glaciers swallowed Europe, people ran south, west, anywhere but into the cold. But a few didn't run far. They tucked themselves into the ridgelines of the Carpathians, caves lit by firelight, stone tools buried in soil now covered in pine and ash. And when the ice retreated, they stayed. These weren't empires. These weren't tribes. These were survivors, the last flickers of Europe's Paleolithic soul. Scientists have a word for places like this. Refugia. natural shelters where ancient life clung on, long after it vanished everywhere else. And the Carpathians? They were one of them, which makes the Lemkos more than just a displaced people. It makes them a genetic time capsule. Their DNA doesn't follow the rules of modern maps. It doesn't stop at Ukraine's edge or Poland's border. It loops backward, into the Bronze Age, the Neolithic, into the rhythms of Mesolithic foragers who hunted red deer where Lemkos shepherds would later graze flocks. Haplogroup I, Haplogroup M, patterns of maternal inheritance that don't line up with kingdoms or flags, but with climate cycles, glacial retreats, echoes of humans who slept beside mammoths. Their genome doesn't just look Slavic. It looks older, like something preserved by altitude, by isolation, by silence. The same silence that now wraps around old Lemko villages, where only chapel ruins and broken fences remain. If the refugium theory is right, then the Lemkos aren't just descendants. They're fossils that still breathe, holding fragments of a Europe that was almost lost to ice, and later, to war. Not a people erased, but a people left behind, carrying something no one thought still existed. Could the Lemkos be the last living strand of a forgotten European ancestry? For decades, they ticked the box marked other, or left it blank, because the form didn't have a space for Lemko. But in the 2011 census, something changed. Thousands stood up and wrote it down. Not Polish, not Ukrainian, just Lemko. No nation gave them that name. No government taught them to use it. It came from somewhere deeper, from family stories whispered after dinner, from songs hummed by grandmothers while folding linens older than the border, from the ache and the silence that came after Vistula. Across Poland, across Canada, across the fractured lines of exile, the Lemko diaspora began to stitch itself back together, through DNA results that didn't explain them, but pointed them home, through land records from 1785, through smudged maps with names scratched out by war, now redrawn by memory. In Cleveland, one man found his great-grandfather's village by matching the name to a burned-out church foundation. He cried when he saw the bell, cracked, but still ringing. In Zdynia, every summer, the Vatra fire burns. Lemko kids dance barefoot in embroidery stitched by their great-grandmothers. Behind them, a young woman reads aloud a poem in a language her school tried to erase. Her name is Oksana, and when they asked her why she keeps going, she said, "We're not lost. We were just hidden in plain sight." But the truth is more fragile than fire, because language can fade, rituals can fracture, and even the strongest DNA needs a voice to carry it forward. Science can prove where we come from, but it can't tell us what to keep. And now, the question hangs in the air like wood smoke at twilight. Can culture survive when genes alone aren't enough? Somewhere inside the double helix, there's a story we haven't told yet. Two signatures, Haplogroup I and the elusive M star, found together in one of Europe's smallest peoples. And still, no one can fully explain why. We know they're ancient. We know they don't belong to any modern state. We know they whisper of migrations before history, before language. But we don't know what they're still doing here. Why they remain, not in cities, not in capitals, but in mountain villages, in forgotten bloodlines, in the bones of a people the world tried to erase. The Lemko genome holds something unfinished, a message from before Europe was Europe, a signal that doesn't answer questions, it opens them. How many other codes like this are waiting? In a shepherd's child from the Balkans, in a grandmother in the Caucasus, in the silence behind someone's surname they never learned to pronounce. Every genome is a puzzle, not just of ancestry, but of belonging. Because sometimes, you don't find out who you are in a textbook, or a classroom, or a border checkpoint. You find it in a fragment of mitochondrial drift, passed down like a secret your ancestors never meant to bury. And when you test your DNA, and that strange percentage pops up, that forgotten region, that trace amount, that word you've never seen, that's not a mistake. It's a door. Open it. Because the Lemkos, and everything they carry, were never meant to be the end of a story. They're a clue to how much we've forgotten, to how much is still hidden, to how identity survives, even when names don't, and maybe to how far back our story really goes. Because sometimes, the truth about who we are, is older than history itself.